The issue that we want to make sure you're all aware of before getting into it with a Mormon is, of course, to understand the fundamental differences and, I guess, challenges that they are going to present to you along the way. While there's always going to be two ways to oppose something, you can do so through violence or you can do so through ideas, and you're definitely going to experience more of the latter as opposed to Muslims and communists that primarily oppose Christianity through violence. But understand that the Bible made it explicitly clear that we need to be as prepared to endure persecution as we are to answer and recognize false prophets. Like we talked about 2 weeks prior, Jehovah's Witnesses are as easy to contend with as they are difficult because they only ever confront Christianity on the deity of Christ. Sure, they'll disagree with other doctrines like the Trinity, the nature of hell, the authority of Scripture, and salvation itself. But if you get down the deity of Christ, like literally into the Greek, that you can show from the Old to the New Testament that these things all flow in one consistent message, the rest will take care of itself. They will have to meet on some common ground. Mormons, on the other hand, are up there as far as the most difficult to deal with as far as cult groups go for 3 reasons. First, the most active are also the most uninformed. Like you mentioned, the missionary groups that they send out across the world, rarely are they ever local boys and girls. They are being sent with not only an incentive, but a purpose that is tying them back to their families at home. And in this state of isolation, it's very easy for them to be victimized, to have need to make their faith their own, and to essentially, and this is something that can be said for them in a positive sense, get their feet wet in the deep end of the pool before they've even learned to swim. Now, this is a disadvantage for us because, first and foremost, when I've had conversations with Mormon missionaries, the biggest challenge for me wasn't to converse with them about the differences between Mormonism and Christianity. They didn't know the differences between Mormonism and Christianity. They just paid lip service to these sort of beliefs without ever thinking them through, and I'd have to spend more time in the conversation converting them to Mormonism before holding them to account for anything that it actually teaches. That's something that you need to be prepared for, and it's oftentimes going to be difficult for someone who doesn't understand Mormonism. They just understand their own belief, because this is what leads into the second issue. The most sinister aspect of Mormon debate is to attack the dictionary rather than the doctrines themselves. And we've talked about this in the program many times, but the main issue is that even in the most polite and plain conversations that you'll have with them, it's ultimately going to come down to them agreeing with you 100% on everything you say about the fundamentals of Christianity until you make the, I won't say mistake, but the actual root of the issue in saying, what do you mean by that? And if you press them on certain things, like, for example, our non-negotiables as far as the roots of Christianity is monotheism, deity of Christ, nature of the Trinity, authority of Scripture, salvation by grace through faith. Let's just start with that first one. If I say monotheism, you go into the Latin and the Greek, mono meaning one, theos meaning God. We believe in one God. That's not difficult, right? Wrong, because if you say, I'm a monotheist, they're going to agree with you. Then you ask, what do you mean by monotheism? It's regarding the words of Brigham Young mentioning Adam as the man who became a god and being the God with which we have to do on this planet. And that at the same time, there are an infinite number of gods across the universes, all with their own planets and harems, producing spirit children to populate their worlds like Adam did with ours. If you're listening at home and wondering, where on earth did we get all of that from?
Quick clarification. Did Adam become Jesus then? Is Jesus and Adam the same person? Or
Adam
I thought
God.
Jesus was the God of earth.
He will become the God of this earth.
Oh, he will be. He's not there yet.
Yeah, Elohim is the God that came from a different planet that is now spiritually populating ours. Jehovah, which is what Jesus will ultimately become, will be the God of this earth, but because his work of redemption, not according to the Bible, but according to Joseph Smith and the presidents of the church's writings, are ultimately stemming from a conflict between two of Elohim's spirit children, Lucifer and Satan, or Lucifer and Jesus, excuse me, but they won't make the distinction.
Yeah.
So that's the gist of it, is Adam God was clarified by Brigham Young later to be the Elohim of this world. accounts are, of course, going to conflict with one another, but that's the stem of it.
Gotcha.
And you don't need to necessarily know all this unless you're going to be put into this situation conversationally. But that's why we want to lay down these rules, is that you use a word, they're going to be at the same time right there with you and 10,000 miles away. And you need to be willing to take those kinds of steps. So in dealing with Mormons, what's the best way to be prepared to deal with them the way you'd want to deal with anyone that's lying to you? The answer, of course, is to first understand that this could be knowingly or unknowingly. We talked about that last week. But in terms of dealing with objections, the 3 rules, and we're going to have some overlap in this, but we want to go into more detail, is that first and foremost, always ask them to define their terms and where they're getting that from. If you can hammer them home on every single syllable, then it's going to become apparent very quickly that you're talking about 2 belief systems, and the most important aspect of it is that they will recognize that too. If you're talking to a faithful Mormon who knows that they can lie to you like their con man prophet before them, then that's going to be a bit harder to deal with. But if you're dealing with just a Mormon missionary, which is going to be 90% of the time, you will be educating them as much as yourself on the sort of issues that really bring up that divide. So starting with that first rule, always define your terms and ask them to define theirs, which is, of course, the second rule. Make sure you play by the first rule, too, that if you're going to bring something up, you're ready to show them chapter and verse and explain, this is what I mean by that.
Yeah.
And by what I mean, this is what the Bible means, the Christianity meaning of this. And if, of course, they notice that's not what I was taught, then once again, you're making more headway than if you just talked a straight up Bible-y conversation and didn't know what each other were talking about when it came down to it.
It amazes me how many believers I've talked to who's had Mormon friends, and they would walk away thinking, I don't know how to say that they're not Christian. I mean, they believe all the same things. They, as far as I can tell, they're as Christian as we are, maybe even more. Over and over again. Not just with missionaries, but just other local, church attending Mormons, faithful Mormons who, like the first objection is, hey, we're just another denomination like all other evangelical Christians. We believe in the same God and the same Bible, the same Jesus.
But those words mean very different things, and you need to be able to call them out on it.
So if they say a word that is quote unquote Christianese, meaning, oh yeah, okay, we're on the same page. We're not on the same page. Ask, well, what do you mean by, monotheism? What do you mean by the words that you're using?
Yeah, not even necessarily limited to Christianese, even the most plain and basic terms like saved. Saved to them just means that your body's preserved for judgment. Doesn't mean that you're ransomed from anything or kept out of harm. So be aware of that. They're going to play fast and loose with a lot of terms, not necessarily to their fault, but certainly as the key issue of conflict. Because just like what's so evil about the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Watchtower is that they were the first cult to fundamentally alter the Bible in favor of their aberrant doctrines, Mormonism instead has redefined the language and saying that it's not just that we disagree, it's that this is what we mean. And most people aren't willing to get down to what they mean because they assume we're both speaking English, so we mean the same things. I guess an advantage of the internet age is that more and more nonsense is taken from very common terms, so that might be good warm-up training for them. But the point and emphasis always needs to stand or fall on that, is what do you mean by every single word that is said? And this doesn't necessarily mean go full Jordan Peterson on them and say, what do you mean by God? What do you mean by in? What do you mean believe? All that stuff, right? So, a little impression for you. Going into this, the third rule, and this is one that I actually got from my grandfather. He was a medical malpractice attorney, so take that for what you will as far as its influence on my personality. But he always told my father and his grandson after him, never ask a question that you don't already know the answer to. Because as I am going to hammer home as often as I can, these organizations have no problem lying to you and to their members, to their congregants. And whether it's first or secondhand lying, if they give you false information and you're able to call them out on it, you put yourself at a disadvantage by not knowing what they're supposed to say. Now, let me say that again slowly. You put yourself at a disadvantage by not saying what you're supposed to say. If they just come up with an answer pulled straight out of a hat, that could be and sound completely sufficient to you, and they can, sling the Christian hash and all that other stuff, but it's ultimately going to amount to nothing because it means the opposite of what they are supposed to be preaching to the nations, and likewise the opposite of what Christ himself taught in Scripture. So this is the best way to stay one step ahead of a purposefully dishonest organization like the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints, also known as Mormons. Make sure that if you challenge them on something, you know the right answer so that when they lie, you can call them out on it, chapter and verse, see Rules 1 and 2. So, anything to note on that before we get into the top 5 objections you can expect to hear?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Can you comment on not getting yourself tangled up in following rabbit trails in these conversations? You mentioned those couple of first rules, but there's also a tendency to hammer away at some genuinely secondary issue.
Yeah.
And be too passionate about that and forgetting to focus on the fundamentals.
Well, the saying goes, if you aim at nothing, you'll always hit it. If the goal of the conversation is from the start to talk about Jesus, to talk about grace, to talk about there being one God, to talk about there being a reason to trust Scripture above and beyond doctrines and covenants, pearl of great price, or the Book of Mormon, then if something else comes up, you can easily just say, I'd love to talk about that, but right now this is what's important to me and what I hope that we both are on the same page on. And if they try to divert into things like we talked about last week about end times and things that aren't ultimately going to get down to the heart of the differences, then I'd say just being as polite as they are willing to be with you. Match the energy.
So it's important to ask, what do you mean by that? So, for example, if I say, well, when you say that you agree that the Bible is inspired, what do you mean by inspiration?
Yeah.
What do you mean by inerrancy, that it's true? I don't want to get into a debate about the meaning of inspiration. Let's go ahead and go with their definition, as long as we understand that we have a different definition. But we don't need to try to correct them and say, well, you're using that word wrong. Well, they're not going to change what they mean by the words that they use. But it's good that they know that you know what's behind the curtain.
Yeah, and that's obviously going to be the first and greatest step, is when the conversation starts, make sure it continues that direction. If inerrancy is the subject, by all means, but make sure that you are keeping that tempo. You are the one who's in the driver's seat as far as the conversation, because if they say, well, I haven't studied enough on this, that's a great opportunity, because you can say, well, here's what I've studied about this. Go into the conversation with what you know. Don't get caught up in the things that they hope you don't.